The cowboy's shocking announcement silenced the entire ballroom, but one look from the woman beside him suggested he had just made the biggest gamble of his life. "We're already married." The crystal chandelier stopped swaying. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered across the polished floor. Every face in the ballroom turned toward the tall rancher standing beside the humiliated stranger. Her fingers had gone rigid in his grasp. Across the room, a powerful businessman slowly rose from his chair, and in that frozen silence, the cowboy said something that made the danger even worse. "Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today." The wind carried the smell of cattle, wood smoke, and damp pine as Josephine Carter stepped off the stagecoach in Cedar Bluff. Late autumn had settled over Eagle Ridge Valley. The mountains beyond town were already dusted with snow. Wagons crowded the streets. Ranch hands shouted across stock pens. Buyers from Cheyenne and Denver moved between auction lots with ledgers tucked beneath their arms. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to be. Everyone except her. Josephine adjusted the worn strap of her carpet bag and looked down Main Street. $3.80 remained in her pocket. She knew the exact amount because she counted it every night before bed. For 4 days, she searched for work. A tailor shop needed help until the owner saw her. A restaurant claimed they had already hired someone. A hotel clerk promised to ask around and never did. The answers changed. The outcome never did. By Thursday afternoon, the cold felt sharper. She stopped at Martha Green's boarding house and paid for another night. Martha, a widow with silver hair and tired eyes, slid a cup of coffee across the counter without charging her. "You hear about the gathering at the Whitaker Hotel?" Martha asked. Josephine wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "No. Big cattle auction celebration tonight. Wealthy folks, investors, railroad men. Sometimes they need seamstresses for alterations." Hope was a dangerous thing. Still, it was better than hunger. As sunset painted the mountains bronze, Josephine walked toward the largest building in town. The Whitaker Hotel glowed with lantern light. Music drifted through open windows. Inside, polished boots crossed expensive rugs. Crystal glasses flashed beneath chandeliers. Women in silk dresses laughed beside tables covered with roasted beef, pies, and imported wine. Josephine suddenly felt every patch on her coat. But she kept walking. A hostess directed her toward the ballroom. She spotted Lydia Whitaker immediately. Beautiful, perfectly dressed, surrounded by admirers. Josephine waited until the conversation paused. "Miss Whitaker," she said politely, "I heard someone might need sewing work done." The room quieted. Lydia looked her over slowly. Her smile arrived a moment later. It never reached her eyes. "Sewing work?" A few nearby guests turned. "Yes, ma'am." Lydia lifted the sleeve of her expensive gown. "Do I look unfinished to you?" Soft laughter followed. Josephine kept her posture straight. "No, ma'am." "Then perhaps you've come to the wrong party." More laughter. Someone whispered. Someone else chuckled. The sound spread through the ballroom. Heat climbed into Josephine's face. She could leave. She probably should. But something inside her refused to move. Lydia stepped closer. "You know," she said lightly, "this evening was meant for invited guests." The room waited. Josephine tightened her grip on her bag. "I was only looking for work." "Of course you were." The words landed like a slap wrapped in silk. A few people laughed again. Then suddenly the laughter stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Josephine noticed heads turning toward the entrance. A tall man stood near the ballroom doors. Broad shoulders, dark coat, weathered face. The kind of man who spent more time outdoors than inside. Clay Bennett. Even Josephine knew the name. Half the valley did. He crossed the room without hurry, without speaking. without looking at anyone except her. The silence grew heavier with every step. Lydia's smile flickered. "Mr. Bennet," she said. "We were only—" "I heard." His voice was calm. That somehow made it stronger. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Clay stopped beside Josephine. She looked up at him, confused. He looked at the crowd, then at Lydia, then back at Josephine. Before she could speak, he reached for her hand. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Clay's fingers closed gently around hers, and then he said the words that changed everything. "You can stop wondering why she's here." His gaze swept across the room. "We're already married." Silence crashed over the ballroom. Nobody laughed now. For a long moment, the only sound came from the piano player near the wall. Even he stopped halfway through a note. Josephine stared at Clay Bennet. Clay stared straight ahead. His hand remained around hers. Steady. Certain. As if he had announced the weather instead of a marriage. Lydia Whitaker's face lost its color. "What did you just say?" she asked. Clay finally looked at her. "I said, Josephine is my wife." The room erupted. Questions flew from every corner. When did this happen? Why wasn't anyone told? Married? Amos Whitaker appeared from the far side of the ballroom. The wealthy land speculator moved slowly through the crowd, his silver watch chain glinting beneath the lantern light. His eyes settled on Clay, then on Josephine. Nothing in his face changed. That somehow felt worse. Clay nodded politely. "Excuse us." Before anyone could stop him, he guided Josephine toward the doors. The cold evening air hit them the moment they stepped outside. The ballroom noise faded behind them. Josephine yanked her hand free. "Married?" Clay rubbed the back of his neck. "Yes. We're not married." "I know." She stared at him. The man had the nerve to look tired. "You humiliated one of the richest families in Wyoming." "I know." "You lied to an entire ballroom." "I know." Josephine folded her arms. "Do you know anything else?" For the first time, the corner of Clay's mouth twitched. "Probably." That almost made her laugh. Almost. Instead, she shook her head. "What happens tomorrow when people figure out the truth?" "They won't." The answer came too quickly. That worried her. Clay glanced toward the hotel windows. "We should talk somewhere else." 20 minutes later, they sat in the corner booth of a nearly empty diner near the train depot. A kerosene lamp flickered between them. Coffee steamed from two thick ceramic mugs. Outside, freight wagons rattled across the muddy street. Josephine listened as Clay explained. Amos Whitaker had spent months pushing a marriage between Clay and Lydia. Not because of love, because of land. Railroad surveyors were studying routes through Eagle Ridge Valley. If the Bennett Ranch and Whitaker Holdings joined together, they would control nearly everything worth controlling. "Why not just say no?" Josephine asked. Clay stared into his coffee. "I have loans." The answer surprised her. "You're Clay Bennet." "I'm also a rancher heading into winter." He pulled several folded papers from his coat. Receipts, supply invoices, loan notices, real documents, real numbers. Nothing glamorous. Josephine studied them. Feed costs, fence repairs, equipment orders, debt. A lot of debt. "Amos financed part of it," Clay said quietly. "If I publicly reject Lydia now, he'll pull every favor he has." The diner grew quiet. Josephine looked back at the papers, then at him. "What exactly are you asking?" Clay took a breath. "A temporary marriage." She almost stood up. "No. A year. No. Separate rooms. No. Separate lives. No." He nodded once, as if he had expected every answer. The conversation ended there, or it should have. The next afternoon, a letter arrived at Martha Green's boarding house, Missouri. Josephine recognized Caleb's handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled before she even opened it. The bank was foreclosing. The remaining family property would be auctioned within weeks. Caleb was trying to sound brave. The ink told a different story. That evening, she sat alone on the boarding house porch, watching darkness settle over Cedar Bluff. A horse approached from the road. Clay. He dismounted and handed her an envelope. Inside was a contract. 1 year. Monthly payments. A legal marriage. At the bottom was enough money to save Caleb's property. Josephine read the document twice, then folded it carefully. Neither spoke for a while. Wind moved through the pine trees. Somewhere in town, a church bell rang 7 times. Finally, she looked at him. 1 year. Clay nodded. 1 year. The wedding happened 3 days later. A small church. 2 witnesses. Sheriff Owen Pierce, Martha Green. No flowers. No celebration. No music. Outside, townspeople watched through frosted windows and whispered predictions about how long it would last. Most gave them 6 months. Some gave them less. By sunset, Josephine sat alone in a wagon, heading toward Bennett Ranch. The valley stretched beneath a sky filled with winter stars. The ranch house appeared at the end of a long gravel drive. Lanterns glowed on the porch. Clay carried her bag inside. Neither spoke much. The arrangement suddenly felt very real. A few minutes later, he opened a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. "This room is yours." Josephine stepped inside, then stopped. A sewing table stood beside the window. Shelves waited along one wall. A brand new oil lamp sat beside neatly folded fabric. Even a small basket of thread rested near the table. Everything looked prepared. Ready, as if someone had expected her. Slowly, she turned back toward Clay. "This wasn't done today." "No." "Or this week." "No." The hallway fell silent. Josephine looked around the room once more, then back at him. A question formed before she could stop it. "Clay," his hand tightened slightly around the doorframe, "why was this room prepared months before you ever met me?" Clay looked past her into the room. For several seconds, he didn't answer. The lamp beside the bed cast a soft amber glow across the floorboards. Outside, wind brushed against the house, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Finally, he spoke. "My mother used that room." Josephine waited. "When she died, I couldn't bring myself to empty it." His voice remained steady, but something in it had changed. "A few months ago, I finally did." He glanced toward the sewing table. "I figured someday there might be a reason to use it again." Josephine looked around the room. The answer felt honest. Not complete, but honest. She didn't ask another question. "Good night, Mr. Bennett." A faint smile appeared. "Good night, Mrs. Bennett." The words followed her long after the door closed. Winter arrived hard in Eagle Ridge Valley. By December, frost covered the ranch fences each morning. The creek behind the house carried thin sheets of ice along its edges. Ranch hands wrapped scarves around their faces before heading into the pastures. Josephine slowly found her place. Not because anyone invited her, because work needed doing. The cook's pantry records hadn't been balanced in months. She fixed them. A stack of torn jackets waited for repairs. She mended them. Children from neighboring ranches often spent evenings wandering while their parents worked late. She started teaching them letters and numbers around the dining room table. No announcements, no speeches, just small things. the kind people noticed after they were already done. One evening, Clay entered the house after a 12-hour cattle drive. Snow covered his coat. His boots were white with ice. A bowl of beef stew sat waiting beside the stove. Steam rose from it. Nobody said anything. He simply sat down and ate. The next morning, Josephine found fresh firewood stacked beside the kitchen door before sunrise. No note, no explanation. After that, small habits began appearing between them. A lantern left burning on the porch when he returned late. An extra cup placed beside the coffee pot. A repaired glove waiting on his desk. A chair pulled closer to the stove on cold nights. Nothing dramatic. Everything noticeable. The ranch hands noticed first, then the townspeople. By January, even Cedar Bluff had begun talking differently. Not kindly, not cruelly, just differently. Which irritated Amos Whitaker more than anyone realized. The attacks began quietly. A shipment of fence wire disappeared before reaching the ranch. A feed supplier suddenly canceled a contract. 2 longtime business partners stopped answering letters. Each setback arrived separately. Together, they formed a pattern. One afternoon, Josephine visited the general store for sewing supplies. While waiting near the back office, she overheard voices behind a partially closed door. Amos Whitaker and a railroad representative. She froze. "The road passes through Bennett grazing land," the representative said. "Then we'll make sure Bennett doesn't own it much longer," Amos replied. Paper shuffled. Maps unfolded. Josephine carefully stepped closer. The railroad planned to claim part of the valley for expansion, and Amos intended to profit from every acre. Her stomach tightened. That evening, she returned home carrying more than thread and fabric. She carried knowledge, dangerous knowledge. Clay listened quietly while she explained everything. When she finished, he walked to the window. Snow drifted across the dark yard. "You should have stayed away from this." Too late. A faint smile touched his face, the first she'd seen all week. "Probably." For several moments, neither spoke. Then Josephine asked the question that had bothered her for months. If the railroad takes the land, why risk all this over a fake marriage? Clay looked out toward the barn lights. "It's not about the marriage." "Then what is it?" He hesitated, long enough for the answer to arrive before the words did. "When my father died, people wanted something. When my brother died, people wanted something." His eyes remained fixed on the darkness. "After a while, you stop knowing who to trust." The room grew still. Josephine looked down at the ledger book in her hands. Suddenly, dozens of moments made sense. The separate room, the caution, the distance, the way he always watched before speaking. He had never been searching for a wife. He had been searching for certainty, for someone who wouldn't take more than they gave. And somehow, without either of them noticing, he had found it. A week later, a blizzard rolled out of the mountains. Snow swallowed roads. Visibility vanished. Clay and Josephine were returning from a neighboring ranch when the storm trapped them halfway home. The nearest shelter was an abandoned mountain cabin used by cattlemen during harsh winters. By nightfall, they sat beside a crackling fire. Wind hammered the walls. Snow piled against the windows. The single room glowed with firelight. Neither seemed eager to sleep. Neither seemed eager for morning. Outside, the storm howled across the Wyoming mountains. Inside, for the first time since their marriage began, silence felt less like distance, and far more like home. The storm lasted through the night. Wind rattled the cabin walls. Snow gathered in drifts against the door. Every now and then, the fire snapped sharply, sending sparks up the stone chimney. Josephine sat near the hearth with a wool blanket across her lap. Clay occupied the chair opposite hers. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt cautious. It felt familiar. Near midnight, Josephine woke briefly and found another blanket folded over her shoulders. Clay was asleep in his chair, or pretending to be. She never asked. By morning, the blizzard had weakened. They rode home beneath a pale gray sky. The mountains stood silent around them. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Snow retreated from the valley floor. The river swelled with melting ice. Fresh grass appeared across the grazing fields. Life returned to Eagle Ridge Valley. Something else returned too. Hope. The ranch felt different now. Clay no longer knocked before entering the kitchen. Josephine no longer hurried away when he came into a room. At supper they shared stories, small ones, memories from Missouri, old cattle drives, mistakes, regrets. The things people only tell someone they trust. One evening, Josephine found a package on the dining table. Inside was a new hymn book. Its leather cover was worn but carefully preserved. "You mentioned missing church music." Clay said it while reviewing ranch invoices, never looking up. Josephine gently ran her fingers over the pages. The gesture stayed with her long after he left the room. Yet neither spoke about what was happening between them. Neither spoke about love. Perhaps they were afraid that saying it aloud might break whatever fragile thing had begun growing. Then the letter arrived. A rider delivered it shortly after noon. The envelope carried Missouri postage. Josephine recognized Caleb's handwriting immediately. Her smile vanished before she reached the second page. She read it twice, then a third time. The family property was in trouble. Mortgage payments had fallen behind. A creditor had purchased the debt. Foreclosure proceedings had begun. The remaining piece of her family's life could be gone within months. She folded the letter carefully. When Clay asked if everything was all right, she simply nodded. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. Days later, another message arrived. This one carried no signature, only instructions. "Meet behind the freight warehouse after dark." Josephine almost ignored it. Almost. That evening, she wrapped herself in a dark coat and walked into town. The railroad yard stood quiet beneath moonlight. A freight engine rested on the tracks, hissing softly. Amos Whitaker stepped from the shadows. Josephine immediately turned to leave. "Your brother's debt belongs to me now." She stopped. The words struck harder than she expected. Amos handed her a folded document. The transfer papers were genuine. Every signature, every seal, every date. "I can take everything he has." Josephine stared at the pages. "What do you want?" Amos removed his gloves. "Leave Clay Bennett." The answer came too quickly, too easily. Amos smiled. "Disappear quietly, and your brother keeps his property." Josephine said nothing. The train yard suddenly felt colder. "If you stay," Amos continued, "your brother loses everything." When she returned to the ranch that night, Clay was repairing a broken harness in the barn. He looked up as she entered. Their eyes met. For a moment, she almost told him. Almost. Instead, she asked if he needed help. He smiled, and she nearly broke. The following weeks became unbearable. She began pulling away. Less conversation, more distance, shorter answers, longer silences. Clay noticed immediately. He never pushed, never demanded explanations, but confusion slowly settled behind his eyes. One evening, he found her standing alone beside the pasture fence watching the sunset. The sky burned orange above the mountains. "Did I do something wrong?" The question was simple, honest. Josephine looked away. "No." He waited. The answer felt incomplete. Both of them knew it. Yet neither moved. Neither spoke. The silence returned. Only now it hurt. A week later, Clay left on a cattle drive south of Cedar Bluff. 3 days, maybe 4. When he rode back through the ranch gate before sunset, something felt wrong immediately. The house looked too quiet, too still. His boots echoed across the porch. Inside, the dining room stood empty. The kitchen was spotless. The hymn book was gone. So was Josephine. Clay climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The bedroom door stood open. The room was nearly bare. Only one thing remained: her wedding ring. It rested on the bedside table beside a folded letter. For several seconds he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Finally he opened the letter. The handwriting trembled slightly. She explained almost nothing. Only that she was sorry. Only that she had to leave. Only that someday he might understand. The house felt impossibly large after that. The town talked. People always did. Some claimed she'd abandoned him. Others claimed the marriage had never been real. Even a few ranch hands quietly wondered if she had used him. Clay never responded. He simply folded the letter and carried it inside his coat pocket. 3 mornings later, he rode into Cedar Bluff before sunrise. Sheriff Owen Pierce was unlocking his office. One look at Clay's face told him everything. What happened? Clay handed him the letter. Hours later, after searching records, interviewing clerks, and examining financial documents, the sheriff uncovered something neither man had expected. The debt, the foreclosure, the timing. Every road led back to one name: Amos Whitaker. Clay stared across the sheriff's desk. The pieces finally fit together. Josephine had never left because she stopped caring. She left because someone had forced her hand. Outside, dawn slowly spread across Cedar Bluff. Inside, Clay rose from his chair. For the first time in months, there was no uncertainty left, only purpose. And before the sun fully cleared the mountains, he was already preparing to ride after the woman he loved. The morning air carried the last chill of spring as Clay saddled his horse behind the sheriff's office. For months, he had spent every waking hour protecting his ranch. Now the ranch could wait. Josephine could not. Sheriff Owen Pierce stood beside him holding a stack of documents tied together with twine. "We've got enough to start pulling threads," he said. Clay glanced down. Railroad surveys, land transfers, debt purchases, names, dates, signatures. Every piece connected back to Amos Whitaker. For years, the businessman had built his influence one quiet transaction at a time. Now those same records threatened to bury him. "I'll handle Whitaker," Owen said. "You find your wife." The word wife settled heavily between them. Not because it was inaccurate, because it was finally true. 3 weeks later, Cedar Bluff buzzed with rumors. Federal railroad auditors arrived unexpectedly. Business ledgers disappeared from Whitaker offices. Former employees began speaking. A bank clerk produced altered debt records. A surveyor admitted several property reports had been falsified. One witness became 3, then 5. Soon even people who once feared Amos found courage in numbers. His empire began cracking from the inside. But Clay heard little of it. He was already hundreds of miles away. Wyoming became Nebraska. Nebraska became Kansas. Then Missouri. He followed fragments: a boarding house register, a church visitor book, a receipt signed in familiar handwriting. Sometimes he arrived a day too late, sometimes a week. Yet each clue pushed him farther east. Each clue carried the same name: Josephine Carter Bennett. Late one afternoon, he rode into a small settlement outside Independence. Children played beside a one-room schoolhouse. A church bell rang somewhere beyond a line of cottonwood trees. The road was muddy from recent rain. A wagon rolled past carrying seed corn. Everything looked ordinary. Then he saw her. She stood near the schoolhouse porch helping a young girl button a coat. The wind lifted a loose strand of hair across her cheek. For a moment, neither moved. Months of distance disappeared in a single heartbeat. Josephine slowly straightened. The little girl ran off toward her family. Still, neither spoke. Clay removed his hat. She stared at him as though she wasn't entirely certain he was real. Finally, she crossed the yard. The space between them closed one step at a time. When she stopped, they stood only a few feet apart. "You found me." Her voice barely rose above the wind. "I was always going to." A smile flickered, small, uncertain, real. Josephine lowered her eyes for a second. When she looked back up, they were shining. "I thought you should hate me." Clay shook his head. "I tried." The answer surprised them both. A quiet laugh escaped her. The first either had heard in months. They walked together beneath the cottonwoods as evening settled over the town. No dramatic declarations, no grand speeches. Just truth. The kind that takes time to earn. Josephine told him everything. The threats, the debt, the impossible choice. Clay listened without interruption. When she finished, he handed her an envelope. She opened it. Inside sat a collection of receipts and legal releases. Caleb's debt had been paid, completely. Her hands trembled. "How?" "I sold part of the herd." She stared at him. The breeding stock had taken years to build. Everyone in Wyoming knew what those cattle meant. "You didn't have to do that." "No." Clay looked toward the sunset. "But you would have done the same for your family." Josephine folded the papers carefully. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Then she reached for his hand. This time, neither pulled away. Summer arrived by the time they returned to Eagle Ridge Valley. The mountains stood green beneath clear skies. Wildflowers covered the lower meadows. The ranch hands gathered near the barn the morning they rode through the gate together. Nobody cheered. Nobody needed to. The smiles said enough. Even Martha Green traveled from Cedar Bluff for the celebration that followed. A few weeks later, a wedding took place beneath open skies near the river. The same preacher, the same couple, an entirely different promise. There was no contract waiting on a desk, no deadline, no bargain, only choice. Children chased each other through the grass. Ranch hands shared coffee from tin cups. Music drifted across the valley. Clay stood beside Josephine beneath the Wyoming sun. This time, when he took her hand, nobody questioned it, least of all them. Months later, another piece of news arrived. The railroad company changed direction. A new route bypassed Eagle Ridge Valley entirely. The land Amos Whitaker had spent years trying to control lost nearly all the value he had imagined. The fortune he sacrificed everything to obtain never existed. People in Cedar Bluff talked about that for a long time, but not as long as they talked about Clay and Josephine. The cowboy who asked a woman to be his fake wife. The woman who turned a house into a home. The love that neither expected. And the lesson hidden beneath it all. Land could be lost. Money could disappear. Railroads could change course. But some things carried a value no survey map could measure. Years later, when evening settled over Eagle Ridge Valley and lantern light glowed through the ranch house windows, Clay would sometimes find Josephine sitting on the porch, watching the mountains fade into dusk. He would bring 2 cups of coffee. She would make room beside her. And together, they would watch the last light disappear beyond the Wyoming horizon. No contract. no deadline, no pretending. Only the life they chose, and the love that became real first. As the sun slipped behind the Wyoming mountains and the shadows stretched across Eagle Ridge Valley, Clay and Josephine finally had something neither of them had been searching for when their journey began. Not land, not security, not a contract. Each other. And maybe that's what makes stories like this stay with us long after they're over. Because if you place yourself where Clay once stood, afraid to trust, carrying losses nobody could see, you realize how easy it is to build walls that feel permanent. And if you imagine standing where Josephine stood, forced to choose between the people you love and the future you hope for, you understand how heavy some sacrifices can become. Yet somehow, the moments that heal us rarely arrive as grand miracles. Sometimes they arrive as a hand that stays, a door left open, a promise kept. A person who chooses you again after every reason to walk away. The older I get, the more I believe that love isn't proven in perfect moments. It's revealed in the quiet decisions people make when nobody is watching. The choice to trust again. The choice to forgive. The choice to remain when leaving would be easier. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments. What do you think mattered most in the end? Love, trust, or sacrifice? And if you enjoy stories about second chances, enduring love, and the kind of people who help each other find their way home, I hope you'll stay a while. There are many more heartfelt journeys waiting just down the trail, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.